Picture this: you're sitting in a crowded coffee shop, minding your own business, when suddenly, everyone around you starts pointing and laughing. Not at a funny video on their phones, but at you. At something permanent on your body that means the world to you. Something that represents your deepest pain, your greatest loss, your most sacred memory. This is exactly what happened to Sarah Martinez on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning. She had no idea that the small tattoo on her wrist, the one that brought tears to her eyes every time she looked at it, would become the center of a public humiliation that would change not just her day, but her entire life. What those strangers didn't know was that her simple black ink design carried a story of heartbreak that would make even the strongest person weep. They didn't know about the sleepless nights, the folded flag on her mantle, or the letter she kept in her purse that she could never bring herself to throw away. But, sometimes, when the world seems darkest and cruelest, unexpected heroes appear from the most surprising places. Sometimes a stranger's secret can transform public shame into something beautiful. Sometimes what begins with laughter ends with tears of a completely different kind. This is Sarah's story. This is the day everything changed. Sarah Martinez stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying concealer to the dark circles under her eyes. Another sleepless night had left its mark, just like so many others over the past 2 years. She traced her finger gently over the small tattoo on her left wrist, a simple design that most people would never understand. To them, it probably looked like nothing more than a basic military insignia. To Sarah, it was everything. The tattoo was barely 2 inches long, done in simple black ink. It showed a pair of combat boots with dog tags hanging from the laces, and, underneath, in small script letters, were the words "Always with me" and a date that would forever be burned into her memory, March 15, 2022. The day her world fell apart. Sarah had gotten the tattoo 6 months after the funeral, when the numbness finally wore off and the real grief hit her like a freight train. Her friends and family had advised against it, saying she should wait longer, think it through more carefully. But Sarah knew exactly what she wanted. She wanted something permanent, something that would keep him close to her forever. As she brushed her teeth, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her sister Emma. "Coffee date still on for this morning? I have some news to share." Sarah smiled slightly, grateful for the distraction. Emma had been her lifeline these past 2 years, always checking in, always making sure Sarah was eating, sleeping, and slowly putting her life back together piece by piece. After getting dressed in her usual uniform of jeans and a comfortable sweater, Sarah grabbed her purse and keys. She paused for a moment at the small table near her front door, where a folded American flag sat in a shadow box next to a framed photo of a young man in military dress uniform. His smile was infectious, the kind that could light up any room. That smile had been the first thing she noticed about him at her college friend's party 7 years ago. "See you later, Mike," she whispered, touching the frame gently before heading out the door. It had become a ritual, this daily goodbye. Some people might think it was morbid or unhealthy, but Dr. Peterson, her therapist, had assured her that grief had no timeline and no rules. If saying goodbye to Mike's photo every day helped her function, then that was perfectly normal. The drive to downtown took 20 minutes, giving Sarah time to mentally prepare for socializing. Emma meant well, but sometimes her enthusiasm could be overwhelming for someone who was still learning how to exist in a world without the person she had planned to marry. They had been together for 5 years, engaged for 8 months. The wedding was supposed to be in June 2022, just 3 months after he deployed to Afghanistan for what was meant to be his final tour. Sarah found parking easily and walked into Brewster's Coffee House, a cozy little place she and Emma had been meeting at for years. The familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries usually brought her comfort, but today something felt different. The place was more crowded than usual, filled with people she didn't recognize. She spotted Emma in their usual corner booth, waving excitedly. Emma had the same dark hair and brown eyes as Sarah, but where Sarah had become quiet and reserved since Mike's death, Emma remained vibrant and outgoing. She was the kind of person who made friends with strangers in elevator rides and remembered everyone's birthday. "Sarah! Over here!" Emma called out, standing up to give her sister a tight hug. "You look good. Are you sleeping better?" Sarah slid into the booth across from Emma, automatically pulling down the sleeves of her sweater to cover her wrist. It wasn't that she was ashamed of the tattoo, but she had learned that it sometimes invited questions she wasn't ready to answer. A little better, thanks. So what's this news you mentioned? Emma's eyes practically sparkled with excitement. Okay, you have to promise not to freak out, but I have a date tonight. With someone you actually know. Despite everything, Sarah felt a genuine smile tug at her lips. Emma had been so focused on taking care of her that she had barely dated in the past 2 years. Really? Who is it? Remember David from high school? He moved back to town last month and reached out on social media. We've been texting for weeks, and he finally asked me out. Emma was practically bouncing in her seat. I'm nervous but excited. It's been so long since I've been on a real date. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand. That's wonderful, Em. You deserve to be happy. As they chatted about Emma's date plans and her outfit options, Sarah began to relax for the first time in days. This was exactly what she needed, normal conversation about normal things. For a few minutes, she could almost forget about the constant ache in her chest. Emma excused herself to use the restroom, leaving Sarah alone at the table. She was scrolling through her phone when she overheard a conversation at the table behind her. A group of women around her age were talking loudly, their voices carrying that particular tone people used when they thought they were being clever. Did you see that girl's wrist tattoo? One of them said with a laugh. Those little army boots? How tacky can you get? Sarah's blood ran cold. She looked down at her wrist and realized that when she had reached for her phone, her sleeve had ridden up, exposing the tattoo. Right? Like, we get it, you think soldiers are hot, another voice chimed in. But, getting a tattoo of combat boots? That's some serious daddy issues right there. Maybe she's one of those military groupies, a third voice added. You know the type, they hang around bases trying to snag a soldier boyfriend. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment and anger. Her hands started to shake as she tried to process what she was hearing. These strangers were mocking the most meaningful thing in her life, turning her love and grief into a joke. I bet she's never even known anyone in the military, the first woman continued. It's probably just some trendy thing she saw on Pinterest. That comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Never known anyone in the military? The ignorance and cruelty of the statement took her breath away. She wanted to turn around and tell them exactly what that tattoo represented, wanted to show them the photo of Mike she carried in her wallet, wanted to explain that those tacky combat boots had walked him through 2 tours of duty before carrying him home in a flag-draped coffin. But, instead, Sarah sat frozen, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she had in months. The progress she had made in therapy, the baby steps toward rejoining the world, all of it seemed to crumble in that moment. Oh my God, look, she heard us, one of the women whispered, but not quietly enough. She looks like she's about to cry. The cruel laughter that followed made Sarah's stomach turn. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, desperately wanting to escape but not wanting to make a scene. Where was Emma? Why was this taking so long? Just as Sarah was about to get up and flee to her car, she heard a different voice, deep and authoritative, addressing the women behind her. Excuse me, ladies. The laughter stopped immediately. Sarah turned slightly and saw a man in his 50s standing near the women's table. He was tall and distinguished looking, with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military background. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, but something about his presence commanded immediate attention. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, the man continued, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. And I think there might be something you should know about tattoos like the one you were discussing. The women looked uncomfortable now, clearly not expecting to be confronted. We were just having a private conversation, one of them said defensively. Private, the man raised an eyebrow. In a crowded coffee shop? Where the person you were mocking could hear every word? Sarah watched in fascination as this stranger stepped up to defend her. She still felt mortified, but now there was a flicker of something else, hope that maybe the situation could be salvaged. "Look, sir, we don't know who you are, but this isn't really your business," the second woman said, her earlier confidence wavering. The man's expression grew more serious. "Actually, this is exactly my business. You see, I'm Colonel James Patterson, United States Marine Corps, recently retired after 30 years of service. And that tattoo you find so amusing? I have something very similar." With that, he rolled up his left sleeve, revealing an intricate tattoo that covered most of his forearm. It showed a memorial design with combat boots, a rifle, and a helmet, surrounded by names and dates. But, unlike Sarah's simple design, his was clearly the work of a master artist, every detail rendered with stunning precision. "This represents every Marine I've lost under my command," Colonel Patterson said quietly. 19 good men and women who never made it home. Each name, each date, burned into my memory and my skin. The coffee shop had gone completely quiet. Other patrons had stopped their conversations and were listening to every word. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes as she realized the stranger understood exactly what her tattoo meant. "So when you mock someone's military tattoo," the colonel continued, "when you assume they got it for fashion or to impress someone, you're mocking something sacred. You're laughing at love, at loss, at sacrifice you couldn't possibly understand." Sarah saw Emma returning from the restroom, confusion clear on her face as she took in the scene. The three women at the table looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. One of them mumbled an apology, but the colonel wasn't finished. "That young lady you were so entertained by," he said, gesturing toward Sarah, "is wearing her heart on her sleeve, literally. And, instead of respect, you chose cruelty. Instead of compassion, you chose ignorance." Sarah felt overwhelmed by gratitude toward this stranger who had stepped in when she couldn't defend herself. But she also realized that her private grief had become very public, and that terrified her almost as much as the original mocking had. The colonel looked directly at Sarah for the first time since the confrontation began. His eyes were kind but serious, and she could see decades of command experience in his expression. "Miss, I hope you won't let their ignorance diminish the meaning of what you carry with you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a coffee shop full of people who had just witnessed something profound. The three women quickly gathered their things and left, clearly embarrassed and chastened by the encounter. Emma hurried over to Sarah's table, full of questions and concern. "What just happened? Are you okay?" But Sarah couldn't answer immediately. She was still processing the kindness of a stranger, the unexpected defense of something she held dear, and the realization that her tattoo, and the story behind it, had just become very public in a way she had never intended. As she looked around the coffee shop, she saw people looking at her with expressions that had completely changed. Where there might have been curiosity or judgment before, now there was something that looked like respect, even sympathy. Sarah touched her wrist gently, feeling the raised edges of the tattoo under her sweater. Maybe hiding it had been the wrong approach all along. Maybe Mike's memory deserved better than to be concealed out of fear of other people's reactions. The morning that had started like any other had become something entirely different. Sarah had no idea that this was just the beginning, that the mysterious colonel's intervention would lead to discoveries that would change not just her day, but her entire understanding of Mike's service and sacrifice. As Emma settled back into the booth, full of questions and protective fury on behalf of her sister, Sarah realized that for the first time in 2 years, she felt less alone in carrying Mike's memory. A stranger had understood, had stood up for what that memory meant, and had shown her that there were people in the world who would honor rather than mock the love she carried. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Colonel Patterson's intervention, something in his eyes when he looked at her tattoo that suggested this encounter was more than just a kind stranger defending another stranger. Little did Sarah know that Colonel Patterson's decision to speak up had nothing to do with general principle and everything to do with a specific young Marine whose photo he carried in his own wallet, whose sacrifice he thought about every single day, and whose fiancée he had been hoping to find for over 2 years. 3 days after the coffee shop incident, Sarah found herself thinking about Colonel Patterson more than she cared to admit. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her tattoo, something that went beyond general military camaraderie. She had replayed the encounter dozens of times in her mind, analyzing every word, every expression, every gesture. Emma had insisted on staying with her for the rest of that Tuesday, convinced that Sarah needed emotional support after what she called the coffee shop ambush. But, surprisingly, Sarah felt stronger than she had in months. The Colonel's defense of her tattoo had validated something she had questioned privately: whether honoring Mike so publicly was appropriate, whether she was holding on too tightly to the past. Now, as she sat in Dr. Peterson's office for their weekly session, Sarah found herself eager to discuss the encounter with someone who could help her process it objectively. "It sounds like this Colonel Patterson made quite an impression," Dr. Peterson observed, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through her office windows. "How did it feel to have someone defend you like that?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Empowering, I think. For so long, I felt like Mike's death was this private tragedy that no one else could understand." But, the Colonel understood immediately. He didn't need explanations or backstory. He just knew. "And that recognition meant something significant to you." "Everything," Sarah said quietly. "For 2 years, I felt like I was carrying this grief alone. Even you, even Emma, even people who love me, there's still this gap in understanding." But, he looked at my tattoo and immediately knew it represented loss, not fashion. Dr. Peterson leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, have you considered that this encounter might be an opportunity to connect with other people who have experienced similar losses? Military families, other widows, support groups?" The suggestion made Sarah uncomfortable. She had resisted grief counseling groups before, partly out of stubbornness and partly out of fear. The idea of sitting in a circle sharing her pain felt too vulnerable, too raw. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Sarah admitted. This thing with the Colonel was different. It was spontaneous, natural. Support groups feel so structured. "Sometimes structure is what we need to feel safe enough to be vulnerable," Dr. Peterson said gently. "But, I'm not pushing. I'm just noting that you seem to find comfort in being understood by someone who shared your experience." That afternoon, Sarah drove to the grocery store, mentally planning meals for the week. It was one of those mundane tasks that had become significant since Mike's death, proof that she was taking care of herself, that she was functioning. She was debating between chicken and fish when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Excuse me, are you Sarah?" She turned around to find Colonel Patterson standing there, looking slightly uncertain. He was wearing jeans and a Marines t-shirt, looking more casual than he had at the coffee shop but no less commanding in presence. "Colonel Patterson," Sarah said, surprised. "What a coincidence." "Actually, it's not," he admitted, looking embarrassed. "I asked around and found out you shop here regularly. I was hoping to run into you." The honesty caught Sarah off guard. "You were looking for me? Why?" The Colonel glanced around the busy store, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "There's something I need to tell you about your tattoo, about what it represents. Something that might be important for you to know." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. "What do you mean?" "Not here," he said, looking around at the other shoppers. "Would you be willing to have coffee with me? Somewhere we can talk privately?" Every instinct Sarah had developed about staying safe screamed that she should say no. This man was essentially a stranger, regardless of his heroic intervention 3 days ago. But, there was something in his expression, a combination of nervousness and determination, that suggested this was important. "Okay," she heard herself saying. "When?" "Now, if possible." "I know that sounds urgent, but I've been debating whether to reach out for 2 years, and, after seeing you the other day." He trailed off, seeming to struggle with his words. Sarah abandoned her grocery cart and followed Colonel Patterson to a small diner a few blocks away. They sat across from each other in a booth near the back, away from other customers. The Colonel ordered coffee but didn't touch it when it arrived. Sarah noticed his hands weren't entirely steady. "I need to ask you something first," he began. "The date on your tattoo, March 15th, 2022. And the name you mentioned to your sister, Mike. Are you talking about Sergeant Michael Chun?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The fact that this stranger knew Mike's full name and rank sent chills down her spine. How do you know that? Colonel Patterson reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. He slid it across the table to Sarah with shaking hands. It showed a group of Marines in combat gear, but one face was circled in red ink. It was Mike. Sarah stared at the photo, her mind reeling. I don't understand. How do you have this? Because Sergeant Michael Chen was under my command, Colonel Patterson said quietly. He was one of my Marines. The diner seemed to fade away around Sarah. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to process what she was hearing. You were there? You were there when he... I was there when he died, yes. I was the one who wrote the letter to his family. I was the one who recommended him for the Bronze Star. And I've been carrying his photo in my wallet every day since we lost him. Sarah felt like she couldn't breathe. After 2 years of grieving alone, of having only memories and official reports, here was someone who had been there, who had known Mike as a soldier, who had witnessed his final moments. Tell me about him, she whispered. Tell me about who he was over there. Colonel Patterson's expression softened. He was one of the best Marines I've ever had the privilege to command. Brave, yes, but more than that, he was kind. In a place where kindness could get you killed, Mike never lost his humanity. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. He talked about you constantly. Showed pictures to anyone who would look. He had this plan to surprise you with a romantic proposal when he got home, something about recreating your first date? Sarah's eyes filled with tears. The Botanical Garden. We met at Emma's party, but our first real date was at the Botanical Garden downtown. He said it was where he knew he wanted to marry me. He had it all planned out. He'd saved up to buy you the ring you'd dreamed about, had arranged to have the same flowers from that first date planted in the garden's proposal section. He was going to do it on the anniversary of that first date. The tears were flowing freely now. Sarah had known Mike loved her, had known he wanted to marry her, but hearing about these specific plans from someone who had been there, who had listened to Mike share his dreams, was both healing and heartbreaking. There's more, Colonel Patterson continued. The day he died, he wasn't supposed to be on that patrol. He volunteered to take the place of another Marine whose wife had just had a baby. Said the new father deserved to make it home more than he did. Sarah felt a sob escape her throat. This was so exactly like Mike, always putting others first, always thinking about what was right rather than what was safe. I need you to understand something, the colonel said, leaning forward. Mike died instantly. There was no pain, no suffering. One moment he was joking with his unit about the terrible food, the next moment he was gone. He died doing what he believed in, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. For 2 years, Sarah had tortured herself with questions about Mike's final moments, whether he had been afraid, whether he had suffered. The official reports had been clinical and cold. But hearing it from someone who had been there, who had cared about Mike as a person, provided a comfort she hadn't known she needed. Why didn't you contact me before, she asked. At the funeral, or after? Colonel Patterson looked uncomfortable. I wanted to. I started a dozen letters I never sent. I showed up at the cemetery twice and couldn't bring myself to approach you. How do you tell someone's fiancé that you were the one who sent him on the mission that killed him? You didn't send him, Sarah said firmly. He volunteered. You just told me that. Intellectually, I know that. Emotionally. He shrugged. I've carried guilt about every Marine I've lost, but Mike was different. Maybe because he talked about you so much, maybe because he was so young and had so much to live for. I don't know. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah was processing the overwhelming gift of new information about Mike while simultaneously dealing with the shock of meeting someone who had been there during his final weeks. There's something else, Colonel Patterson said eventually. Something I think you should have. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. Mike kept a journal. Not official or anything, just personal thoughts. I found it among his effects and I kept it. I know I should have sent it with his other belongings, but I read some of it and it was so personal, so full of love for you. I was afraid it would be too painful for his family." Sarah stared at the notebook like it might disappear if she blinked. "You've had this for 2 years?" "I've read it probably 100 times. It helped me understand who Mike was beyond the uniform. But it belongs with you. It was always meant for you." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the notebook to a random page. Mike's familiar handwriting filled the lined pages, and just seeing it made her heart race. She read a few lines. "Sarah's birthday is in 3 weeks, and I still can't decide if I should call or send a video message. I want to hear her voice so badly, but I also don't want her to hear how tired I am. She worries enough already. I think I'll send flowers with a note saying I'm saving my voice to tell her I love her in person." Sarah closed the notebook, overwhelmed. "I can't. This is too much." "I know it's a lot," Colonel Patterson said gently. "But I've been carrying pieces of Mike for 2 years, and it's time they went to where they belong. With the person he loved most." Sarah looked across the table at this man who had inadvertently become the keeper of her fiancé's memory. "Why now? Why after 2 years?" "Because I saw your tattoo and realized I wasn't the only one carrying him with me every day. Because I saw those women mock something sacred and I couldn't stay silent. And because I recognized something in your eyes that I see in my mirror every morning, the look of someone who's been carrying grief alone for too long." The colonel finished his coffee and signaled for the check. "I don't want to overwhelm you more than I already have. But if you ever want to know more about Mike's time overseas, about the man he was as a Marine, I'd be honored to share those stories with you." As they prepared to leave the diner, Sarah felt like her entire world had shifted. 3 days ago, her tattoo had been mocked by strangers. Today, it had led her to someone who could fill in the missing pieces of Mike's story. "Colonel Patterson," she said as they walked toward their cars. "Thank you. For defending me at the coffee shop, for keeping Mike's memory alive, for bringing me his journal. I don't know how to repay this." "You don't repay it," he said simply. "You honor it. You live the life Mike wanted you to live. You let yourself be happy again when you're ready." As Sarah drove home, Mike's journal beside her on the passenger seat, she felt something she hadn't experienced since his death, a sense of connection to his military life that went beyond official reports and formal condolences. Colonel Patterson hadn't just defended her tattoo, he had given her back pieces of Mike she never knew existed. But she also sensed that this encounter was just the beginning. The colonel had mentioned other Marines, other stories, other connections to Mike's service. There was a whole world of people who had known and cared about Mike that she had never been part of. For the first time since Mike's death, Sarah felt like she was not alone in carrying his memory. And, for the first time, she began to wonder if maybe Dr. Peterson had been right about connecting with others who understood her loss. That night, Sarah sat in her kitchen with Mike's journal, a cup of tea, and the courage to read the words he had written during his final weeks. She had no idea that those pages would reveal not just Mike's love for her, but also his concern for his fellow Marines, his plans for their future, and a secret project he had been working on that would soon bring even more unexpected people into Sarah's life. Sarah spent 3 hours that first night reading Mike's journal, crying and laughing in equal measure as his personality came alive through his handwriting. The entries spanned his entire final deployment, from his arrival in Afghanistan through his last day, and they painted a picture of a man who was simultaneously homesick and dedicated, lonely and surrounded by brotherhood, afraid and brave. The early entries were full of excitement about their upcoming wedding and frustration at being away from her. Mike had written detailed plans for their honeymoon, descriptions of the house he wanted to buy for them, and long passages about how much he missed simple things like watching movies together or hearing her laugh at his terrible jokes. But, as Sarah read deeper into the journal, she began to notice patterns that both touched and worried her. Mike had been concerned about several of his fellow Marines who were struggling with the stress of deployment. He wrote about Rodriguez, who had stopped eating regularly after receiving a Dear John letter from his girlfriend. He mentioned Thompson, who had become increasingly reckless during patrols after learning his father had cancer. There was Jackson, who had started having panic attacks but was afraid to report them for fear of being sent home. What struck Sarah most was how much emotional energy Mike had been spending on taking care of others. His entries describe late-night conversations with homesick Marines, care packages he organized for those whose families couldn't afford to send them, and his own rations shared with anyone who seemed to be struggling. One entry from February made Sarah's breath catch. Sarah always says I have this need to fix everyone, and I guess she's right. But how can you watch good men fall apart and not try to help? Rodriguez cried in his bunk last night, thinking no one could hear. Thompson took unnecessary risks again today, like he's trying to prove something or maybe like he doesn't care what happens to him. I keep thinking about what Sarah would do if she were here. She'd find a way to help them all, probably better than I can. She has this gift for making people feel less alone. I wish I could bring some of that to this place. Sarah wiped away tears as she realized Mike had been trying to channel her compassion even while thousands of miles away. It was so like him to think about what she would do, to try to honor her values in his own actions. But then, she found an entry that changed everything. It was dated March 10th, just 5 days before Mike died. I've been working on something that I hope Sarah will understand. If something happens to me over here, I don't want the guys to be forgotten. I've been collecting stories, addresses, photos, creating a record of who they really are beyond their service numbers. Rodriguez is an amazing artist who draws portraits of everyone's families. Thompson teaches kids soccer leagues back home and coaches a team for underprivileged kids. Jackson wants to be a veterinarian and has been caring for the stray dogs around base like they're his patients. If I don't make it home, I want Sarah to know these men. I want her to understand that my death, if it comes, won't just affect her and my family. These Marines are my brothers, and they'll be carrying grief too. Maybe she could help them somehow. Maybe they could help each other. I know it's a lot to ask of someone who will be dealing with her own pain, but Sarah has this way of building connections between people. She sees the best in everyone and helps them see it in themselves. I've started a letter to her explaining all of this, but I can't seem to find the right words. How do you ask the woman you love to take care of your military family if you die? How do you ask her to let strangers share in her grief? I don't know if I'll ever be brave enough to send it. Sarah stared at the page through her tears. Mike had been planning for his death, not out of premonition but out of love for the people around him. He had been thinking about how to connect her with his military brothers because he understood that they would all need each other if the worst happened. She flipped through the remaining pages, looking for the letter Mike had mentioned. She found it tucked between the journal's back pages, sealed in an envelope with her name written in Mike's careful handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me and Colonel Patterson has done what I asked him to do, give you my journal and this letter. I'm hoping that will never be necessary, but if it is, there are things you need to know. First, I love you more than I have ever loved anything in this world. You have been my anchor, my hope, and my reason for fighting to come home every single day. Whatever has happened to me, please don't let it diminish what we have shared. Our love is the best thing I have ever done with my life. Second, I need you to know about my Marines. These men have become my family over here, just like your family became mine when you brought me home for Christmas that first year. They are good men facing impossible situations, and they've watched out for me just like I've tried to watch out for them. If something happens to me, they're going to blame themselves. It's what Marines do, we take responsibility for each other, sometimes to a fault. Rodriguez will think he should have been watching my back more carefully. Thompson will think he should have taken my place. Jackson will think he should have spotted whatever danger I missed. They'll carry guilt that isn't theirs to carry, and they'll need someone to help them understand that. I know this is a huge thing to ask, especially if you're reading this while dealing with your own grief. But, Sarah, you have this gift for helping people heal. You helped me believe I was worth loving when we first met. You helped Emma through her divorce. You helped your coworker Janet when her mom was sick. You see people's pain and you find ways to ease it. These Marines are going to need that. They're going to need someone who understands that losing me was a loss for them too, not just for you and my family. They're going to need someone who can help them process their grief without judgment. I've given Colonel Patterson their contact information and asked him to reach out to them if anything happens to me. I've also asked him to introduce them to you, if you're willing. I know it might seem strange to connect with people you've never met, to share your grief with strangers. But they're not really strangers, they're the people who loved me like a brother. You don't have to do this, Sarah. If it's too much, if it would make your healing harder instead of easier, then please ignore this request. Your well-being is more important than anything I could ask of you. But if you think it might help, if you think connecting with them might bring some comfort or purpose to your grief, then I hope you'll consider it. I love you beyond words. I love you beyond death. I love you enough to ask you to let other people love my memory too. Forever yours, Mike P.S. Rodriguez has been drawing a portrait of you based on the photos I've shown him. I hope someday he can give it to you in person. Sarah read the letter 3 times before she could fully process what Mike was asking. Even in death, he was trying to take care of everyone, his Marines, the connections between them all. It was quintessentially Mike, this elaborate plan to make sure no one grieved alone. The practical part of her brain immediately started objecting. She barely knew how to handle her own grief, let alone help other people with theirs. She had no experience with military culture beyond her relationship with Mike. What could she possibly offer to Marines who had actually served alongside him? But another part of her, the part that Mike had fallen in love with, was already thinking about Rodriguez drawing alone in his apartment, about Thompson taking dangerous risks because he felt guilty, about Jackson having panic attacks with no one to talk to who understood. The next morning, Sarah called Colonel Patterson. I read the journal, she said without preamble when he answered. And the letter. There was a long pause. I was wondering if you'd find that. Mike made me promise to give you everything, even if I thought some of it might be too much. Have you stayed in contact with his Marines? With Rodriguez and Thompson and Jackson? I've tried to. Military families scatter after deployments end, but I've kept track of most of them. Why? Sarah took a deep breath. I want to meet them. All of them. Mike asked me to help them, and I think maybe they can help me too. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah, are you sure? Grief counseling with strangers can be complicated, especially when military trauma is involved. I'm not sure of anything, Sarah admitted. But Mike was right about one thing, I hate the thought of people grieving alone. And if these men cared about Mike the way he cared about them, then they're not really strangers, are they? Colonel Patterson's voice was gentle when he responded. No, they're not strangers. They're family. And Mike was right about something else too, they have been blaming themselves. Rodriguez moved back to his hometown in New Mexico and hasn't picked up a paintbrush since Mike died. Thompson got out of the Marines early and works construction now, taking every dangerous job he can find. Jackson dropped out of his veterinary program and won't talk to any of his old friends. Sarah felt her heart breaking for these men she'd never met. They're all struggling. They're all drowning, Colonel Patterson said bluntly. And they don't think they deserve help because they survived when Mike didn't. That afternoon, Sarah found herself at Dr. Peterson's office for an emergency session. She spread Mike's journal and letter across the coffee table between them and explained everything. This is a significant development, Dr. Peterson said carefully. You've been grieving in isolation for 2 years, and now you're discovering that there are other people who shared in your loss. How does that feel? Overwhelming, Sarah admitted. But also, relieving? Like maybe I haven't been crazy for feeling like Mike's death affected more than just me and his family. It sounds like Mike understood something about grief that many people miss, that healing happens in community, not in isolation. Sarah nodded. But I'm scared. What if I can't help them? What if I make their grief worse? What if seeing them just makes my own pain worse? Dr. Peterson leaned forward. Those are all valid concerns. But let me ask you this, what do you think Mike would want you to do? The answer came immediately. He'd want me to try. He'd want me to choose love over fear. Then, maybe that's your answer. That evening, Sarah called Colonel Patterson back. I want to do this. I want to meet Mike's Marines. But I need your help organizing it, and I need to know you'll be there for support. Of course, he said immediately. I think Mike would be proud of this decision. I hope so, Sarah said. Because I'm about to invite strangers to share the most painful thing in my life, and I have no idea what I'm doing. None of us do, Colonel Patterson replied. But sometimes the most healing thing you can do is admit you're lost and ask others to help you find your way. As Sarah hung up the phone, she looked at Mike's photo on her mantle. For 2 years, she had been the sole keeper of their love story, the only one carrying their plans and dreams and memories. But Mike's journal had revealed that their story was bigger than just the two of them. It included Rodriguez's art and Thompson's coaching and Jackson's kindness to stray dogs. It included Colonel Patterson's guilt and care packages and all the ways Mike had touched lives she never knew about. Tomorrow, Colonel Patterson would start reaching out to Mike's Marines. Tomorrow, Sarah would begin the terrifying and hopeful process of expanding her grief to include people who had loved Mike in ways she was only beginning to understand. She touched her tattoo gently, thinking about how it had started this entire journey. Those women in the coffee shop had mocked it as meaningless decoration, but they couldn't have been more wrong. It was a key that had unlocked connections she never knew existed, relationships that had been waiting 2 years to begin, and a way of honoring Mike that went far beyond her private memories. Sarah had no idea that Mike's Marines had been waiting for this call just as desperately as she had been waiting to make it, or that their upcoming meeting would reveal not just shared grief but shared purpose, and, ultimately, a way to transform their collective loss into something that could help other military families facing similar tragedies. 2 weeks after Colonel Patterson made the first phone calls, Sarah found herself standing in the parking lot of a community center, fighting the urge to get back in her car and drive home. This was either the bravest or most foolish thing she had ever done, and she wouldn't know which until she walked through those doors. Inside, she would meet 3 men who had shared Mike's final months, who had known him as Sergeant Chan rather than her Mike, who carried their own grief and guilt about the day he died. Colonel Patterson had arranged for them to meet in a neutral location, somewhere that wouldn't feel too formal or too casual for what was essentially a gathering of strangers united by loss. Emma had offered to come for moral support, but Sarah had declined. This felt like something she needed to do alone, at least initially. If these relationships were going to be authentic, they needed to begin with honesty rather than the protective buffer of family members. Sarah pushed through the doors and found Colonel Patterson waiting in the lobby. He looked as nervous as she felt, which was oddly comforting. "They're all here," he said quietly. "Rodriguez drove up from New Mexico yesterday. Thompson took time off from his construction job in Denver. Jackson flew in from Seattle this morning. How are they?" Sarah asked, suddenly, wondering if these men were as apprehensive about meeting her as she was about meeting them. Terrified, Colonel Patterson said with a slight smile. "Rodriguez threw up in the parking lot. Thompson has been chain-smoking since he arrived. Jackson has called his sister 3 times in the last hour." Despite her nervousness, Sarah felt a laugh escape. "So we're all handling this well." "About as well as can be expected when you're about to share your deepest grief with people you've never met." They walked toward a small conference room where 3 men in civilian clothes stood awkwardly around a table set with coffee and donuts that no one was touching. Sarah recognized them immediately from Mike's journal descriptions, even though she had never seen their faces. Rodriguez was compact and dark-haired, with artist's hands and eyes that seemed to take in every detail. Thompson was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of muscular build that came from physical labor, but his posture suggested someone who was constantly braced for impact. Jackson was younger than the others, with a gentle face and the kind of careful movements that suggested he was always thinking about how to avoid causing harm. "Gentlemen," Colonel Patterson said, "I'd like you to meet Sarah Martinez, Mike's fiancée." The formality of the introduction seemed to hang in the air for a moment before Rodriguez stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry for your loss." It was such a standard phrase, one Sarah had heard hundreds of times over the past 2 years, but, coming from Rodriguez, it carried the weight of shared experience. This wasn't someone offering generic sympathy, this was someone who had also lost Mike. "Thank you," Sarah said. And I'm sorry for yours. The acknowledgement that they, too, had suffered a loss seemed to break something open in the room. Thompson's rigid posture softened slightly, and Jackson's careful expression gave way to something more human. Mike talked about you every day, Jackson said suddenly, then looked embarrassed at his outburst. Sorry, he really loved you. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. He loved all of you too. His journal was full of stories about you, about how you took care of each other. Colonel Patterson gestured toward the chairs around the table. Why don't we all sit down? Sarah has some things she'd like to share with you, and I think you have some things to share with her. As they settled around the table, Sarah noticed that each man had placed something in front of them. Rodriguez had a small sketchbook, Thompson had a worn baseball cap, and Jackson had what looked like a veterinary textbook. I don't really know how to do this, Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly. I've never met any of Mike's military friends before. But I read his journal, and I found the letter he wrote asking me to find you if something happened to him. She pulled out copies of the relevant journal pages and the letter, sliding them across the table. He was worried about how you would handle losing him. He wanted me to help you understand that his death wasn't your fault. Rodriguez picked up the letter with trembling hands. As he read, tears began streaming down his face. He wrote this 5 days before he died. He was planning for the possibility, Sarah said gently. Not because he had a premonition, but because he loved you all too much to leave you without support. Thompson slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. Support? We were supposed to protect him. We were his unit, his brothers. How is that not our fault? The pain in his voice was raw and familiar. Sarah recognized the guilt because she had been carrying her own version of it for 2 years. Can I tell you about the guilt I've been carrying? Sarah asked quietly. Thompson nodded, though his jaw remained clenched. The morning Mike deployed for the last time, we had a fight. A stupid fight about whether I should take a promotion at work that would require travel. I was worried about being away if something happened to him, and he was excited about the opportunities it would give me. We said things we didn't mean, and he left without us properly making up. She paused, wiping away tears. For 2 years, I've tortured myself thinking that our last real conversation was an argument. That he died not knowing how proud I was of him, how much I supported his service, how sorry I was for being selfish about the promotion. Jackson leaned forward. But that wasn't your last conversation. No, Sarah said. We talked on the phone 2 days before he died. He called me from base and told me he loved me and that he'd been thinking about our fight. He said he understood why I was scared about the travel, and he was proud of me for even considering it. He made jokes about being a house husband if I became a high-powered executive. We laughed together. She looked around the table at the 3 men. But, 4 months, I only remembered the fight. I let guilt convince me that anger was the last emotion between us, when actually it was love and laughter and support. Rodriguez wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. You're saying we're remembering wrong too? I'm saying grief makes us focus on what we think we did wrong instead of what we did right. Mike's journal is full of gratitude for how you all took care of him. Rodriguez, he wrote about how your artwork reminded him that beauty could exist even in war. Thompson, he wrote about how your strength made him feel safer during patrols. Jackson, he wrote about how your kindness to animals reminded him what they were all fighting to protect. Thompson shook his head. But I should have been on that patrol. I should have taken his place. Why weren't you? Colonel Patterson asked gently. Because my rotation had me on base duty that day. Mike volunteered to cover for Martinez because Martinez's wife had just had a baby. Sarah felt her breath catch. He volunteered to take someone else's place? He always did that, Jackson said quietly. If someone had a good reason to avoid a dangerous assignment, Mike would step up. He said single guys like him could take more risks than Marines with families. The room fell silent as they all processed the implication. Mike hadn't died because his unit failed to protect him. He had died because he chose to protect someone else's opportunity to be a father. That's who he was, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. That's exactly who he was. Rodriguez opened his sketchbook and pulled out a piece of paper. I've been carrying this for 2 years, he said, sliding it across to Sarah. I drew it from the photos Mike showed us, but I could never figure out how to get it to you. Sarah looked down at the most beautiful portrait she had ever seen. Rodriguez had captured not just her physical features, but something in her expression that spoke to joy and hope and love. It was how Mike had seen her, rendered in careful pencil strokes by someone who had never met her but had listened to countless stories about her. It's beautiful, she whispered. It's how he made me feel, beautiful and loved and worthy of being missed. That's how he talked about you, Rodriguez said. Like you were this amazing person who somehow chose to love him. He couldn't believe his luck. Thompson pulled off his baseball cap and set it on the table. This was his. He gave it to me the day before he died, said it was his lucky hat and I needed luck more than he did because I was too reckless. Sarah recognized the cap immediately. It was from Mike's college baseball team, worn and faded from years of use. He loved that hat. He said it reminded him of the day we met because he was wearing it at Emma's party. He told us that story, Jackson said with a small smile. About how you made fun of his hat and then asked if you could try it on, and how he knew right then he wanted to marry you. These men knew stories about her relationship with Mike that she had forgotten, moments that he had treasured enough to share with his unit during long nights overseas. They were keepers of memories she didn't even know she had lost. Jackson pushed his veterinary textbook toward the center of the table. I dropped out of school after Mike died. Couldn't see the point anymore. But he used to help me study, said he wanted to be able to tell people his friend was going to be a great vet. Why did you drop out? Sarah asked. Because I couldn't handle being around life and healing when Mike was dead. Because I felt guilty for surviving when he didn't. Because every time I tried to save an animal, I thought about how I couldn't save him. Sarah understood completely. I turned down that promotion. The one Mike and I fought about. I couldn't handle the idea of moving forward with my life when his had ended. They spent the next 3 hours sharing stories, tears, and, slowly, carefully, laughter. Rodriguez told them about Mike's terrible attempts at sketching, how he had insisted on drawing portraits of everyone in the unit that looked more like abstract art. Thompson described Mike's elaborate practical jokes and his uncanny ability to find the one working vending machine on any base. Jackson shared how Mike had unofficially adopted every stray dog they encountered, giving them names and personalities and worrying about their welfare long after the unit moved on. In return, Sarah told them about Mike's cooking disasters, his obsession with terrible reality TV shows, his habit of talking to houseplants as if they could respond. She shared photos on her phone, videos of Mike attempting to dance at Emma's wedding, recordings of voicemails he had left her that she couldn't bear to delete. By the end of the meeting, they weren't strangers anymore. They were people who had loved the same person in different ways, who understood each other's grief because it stemmed from the same loss. I have an idea, Sarah said as they prepared to leave. Something I think Mike would want us to do together. The three men looked at her expectantly. Mike wrote in his journal about wanting to make sure military families don't grieve alone. What if we created something in his memory? Something that helps other people in our situation connect with each other? Rodriguez sat back down. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet, Sarah admitted. But I know we all have skills that could help people. Rodriguez, your art could help families create memorials. Thompson, your construction experience could help with building projects. Jackson, your veterinary knowledge could help with therapy animals. And I'm learning that I might be good at bringing people together. Colonel Patterson, who had been quietly observing their interactions, spoke up. There are a lot of military families out there who are struggling with exactly what you've all been through. A lot of people who think they have to carry their grief alone. Thompson nodded slowly. Mike would hate knowing that people were suffering the way we've been suffering. So we do something about it, Sarah said. We create the support system that we wish had existed for us. Jackson picked up his veterinary textbook. Maybe it's time I went back to school. Maybe it's time we all moved forward, Rodriguez agreed. Together. As they exchanged phone numbers and made plans for future meetings, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in 2 years: hope. Not just for healing, but for purpose. Mike's death had created a void that could never be filled, but maybe it could be transformed into something that prevented other people from drowning in similar voids. She touched her tattoo through her sweater, thinking about how far she had come since that day in the coffee shop. The women who had mocked it couldn't have known they were setting in motion a chain of events that would connect 4 grieving people and potentially help many more. Mike would be proud, Colonel Patterson said as they walked toward the parking lot. I think so too, Sarah agreed. I think he'd also be amazed that his plan actually worked. But Sarah had no idea that their meeting had been observed by someone else with connections to Mike's story, someone who had been looking for Sarah for even longer than Colonel Patterson had, and someone whose revelation would finally complete the picture of Mike's impact on the lives around him. 3 months after their first meeting, Sarah, Rodriguez, Thompson, Jackson, and Colonel Patterson had fallen into a rhythm of regular gatherings. They met every 2 weeks, sometimes to plan their growing memorial foundation, sometimes just to check in with each other. What had started as shared grief had evolved into genuine friendship and a sense of purpose that surprised them all. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from her job to focus on getting their nonprofit organization off the ground. They had decided to call it Mike's Bridge, reflecting his vision of connecting people who were struggling with loss. Rodriguez had designed a beautiful logo featuring a bridge made of dog tags, and Thompson had volunteered to handle the construction of a memorial garden at the local Veterans Center. Jackson had re-enrolled in veterinary school and was working with them to develop a therapy animal program for military families. Colonel Patterson served as their military liaison, helping them navigate the complex world of veteran services and connecting them with other families who might benefit from their support. On this particular Saturday, they were meeting at Sarah's house for the first time. She had finally felt ready to share that space with them, to let Mike's memory exist alongside new relationships in the place where she and Mike had planned their future together. Sarah was arranging sandwiches on a platter when her doorbell rang an hour early. She opened the door expecting to find Rodriguez, who was always punctual, but instead found a woman in her 50s holding a manila envelope and looking nervous. "Are you Sarah Martinez?" the woman asked. "Yes, can I help you?" "My name is Helen Martinez. I think we might be related. My son was Sergeant Michael Chen." Sarah's heart stopped. She stared at the woman, seeing Mike's eyes and smile in her features, understanding immediately why the last name was different. "You're Mike's mother." Helen nodded, tears already streaming down her face. "I've been looking for you for 2 years." Sarah's mind reeled. Mike's emergency contact forms had listed his father, David Chen, and his stepmother, Linda. There had been no mention of his biological mother at the funeral, no contact from anyone else claiming to be family. I don't understand," Sarah said, stepping back to let Helen inside. "Mike never mentioned you." Helen's face crumpled. "I'm sure he didn't. I haven't been part of his life since he was 8 years old. But I've been trying to find you since I learned about his death because there are things you need to know, things about Mike that his father probably never told you." Sarah led Helen to the living room, her mind spinning. In all their conversations about family, Mike had only ever talked about his father and stepmother, both of whom had been kind but distant at the funeral, focused on their own grief and not particularly interested in maintaining a relationship with Mike's fiancée. "Why have you been looking for me?" Sarah asked, settling into a chair across from Helen. Helen opened the manila envelope and pulled out a thick stack of letters. "Because Mike wrote to me. Every month for the past 5 years, ever since he joined the Marines. I never wrote back, never contacted him, because I thought it was too late, that I had lost the right to be his mother. But I kept every letter." She handed the stack to Sarah with shaking hands. "These letters are full of you. Every single one. Mike wrote to me about your relationship, your engagement, your plans for the future. He wrote to me about his deployment and how much he missed you." The last letter arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Sarah looked at the return address on the top letter, Sergeant Michael Chen, and, below it, for Mom, when you're ready to hear from me. I don't understand, Sarah said. If you got these letters, why didn't you contact him? Why didn't you come to the funeral? Helen's voice broke as she answered. Because I'm an addict, Sarah. I was an addict when Mike was little, and that's why David got custody. I've been clean for 6 years now, but I was too ashamed to respond to his letters, too afraid that I would somehow hurt him again if I came back into his life. She pulled out a tissue and wiped her eyes. When I heard about his death, I wanted to come to the funeral, but David made it clear I wasn't welcome. He said Mike had moved on from me, had built a life without me, and that my presence would only cause confusion and pain for people who were already suffering enough. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest. You were his mother. You had a right to grieve him. Did I? Helen asked quietly. I left him when he was 8 years old to chase drugs and unhealthy relationships. I missed his childhood, his graduation, his decision to join the Marines. What kind of mother does that give me the right to be? Sarah looked down at the letters, seeing Mike's handwriting on envelope after envelope. The kind who raised a son good enough to write to her every month for 5 years, even when she never wrote back. The simple statement made Helen sob openly. Sarah felt her own tears starting as she processed this revelation. Mike had been carrying a relationship with his estranged mother for years, pouring his heart out in letters to someone who never responded, holding on to hope that someday she might be ready to be part of his life again. What did he write about me? Sarah asked softly. Helen smiled through her tears. Everything. He wrote about the day you met, about your first fight, about the way you laugh at your own jokes before you tell them. He wrote about how you take care of everyone around you, how you make him want to be a better man. He wrote about your engagement and how terrified he was that he didn't deserve you. She pulled out one of the letters and opened it. This is from last Christmas, when he was home on leave. He wrote, Mom, I wish you could meet Sarah. Not because I need your approval, I know she's perfect for me, but because I think you two would understand each other. You both have this fierce loyalty to the people you love, even when it costs you. You both carry guilt about things that aren't really your fault. I think Sarah could help you forgive yourself the way she's helped me forgive you. Sarah's breath caught. He forgave you? Apparently. Which is more than I've been able to do for myself. Helen wiped her eyes again. He wrote about his deployment, about being scared but proud of his service. And, in his last letter, the one that arrived after he died, he wrote about you again. About how he was planning to propose when he got home, about the life he wanted to build with you. Helen reached into the envelope one more time and pulled out a small velvet box. He also sent this. Sarah stared at the box, her heart pounding. Is that the engagement ring he bought for you? He sent it to me for safekeeping, said he was worried about it getting lost or stolen overseas. He wanted me to give it to you if something happened to him. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the box. Inside was the most beautiful ring she had ever seen, a simple solitaire diamond that caught the light perfectly, exactly what she had dreamed of but never described to Mike. Somehow, he had known. How did he know what I would want? Sarah whispered. Because he paid attention, Helen said simply. Because he loved you enough to notice the kind of jewelry you admired, the way your eyes lingered on certain rings in store windows. It's all in the letters, months of him researching and planning and wanting to get it exactly right. Sarah slipped the ring onto her finger, where it fit perfectly. For 2 years, she had wondered why Mike had never officially proposed, had sometimes questioned whether he had been as ready for marriage as she thought. Now she knew he had been planning it all along, had been waiting for the right moment to surprise her. There's something else, Helen said. Something I think you need to know about why Mike joined the Marines. Sarah looked up from the ring, which she couldn't stop staring at. He didn't join because of patriotism or family tradition or any of the usual reasons, Helen continued. He joined because he wanted to prove to himself that he could be dependable, that he could be the kind of man who keeps his promises and protects the people he loves. He was afraid that having an addict for a mother meant he might be unreliable too. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. He thought addiction was hereditary? Not the addiction itself, but the character flaws he thought caused it. The selfishness, the inability to put other people first, the tendency to run away when things get hard. He wrote to me about this several times, about wanting to prove that he was different from me. Sarah felt a surge of protective anger on Mike's behalf. He was nothing like that. He was the most selfless person I've ever known. I know that. You know that. But Mike carried the fear that he might disappoint the people he loved the way I disappointed him. The Marines were his way of proving to himself that he could be trusted with other people's well-being. Sarah thought about Mike's journal entries, his constant worry about his fellow Marines, his decision to volunteer for the patrol that killed him. She had always seen these actions as examples of his natural goodness, but now she understood they were also his way of fighting against the fear that he might be inherently selfish like he believed his mother was. He died trying to prove he was worthy of being loved, Sarah said, the tragedy of it taking her breath away. Yes. And he died not knowing that he never needed to prove that to anyone who truly knew him. They sat in silence for several minutes, both crying for different reasons. Sarah was grieving not just Mike's death, but the insecurity he had carried needlessly. Helen was grieving not just her son, but the years of distance between them that could never be recovered. The doorbell rang again, and Sarah realized her friends would be arriving soon. "Would you like to stay?" she asked Helen. "I have some people coming over who knew Mike overseas. They've become family." Helen looked uncertain. "I don't want to intrude on your grief process." "You're not intruding," Sarah said firmly. "You're part of Mike's story, part of the reason he was who he was. I think he would want us all to know each other." When Colonel Patterson, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Jackson arrived, Sarah introduced Helen simply as Mike's mother. She could see the confusion in their eyes. They knew Mike had family issues but didn't know the details. Sarah gave them a brief explanation while Helen sat quietly, still clutching Mike's letters. "So you've been carrying Mike's last words to his mother for 2 years," Rodriguez said to Helen. "That must have been incredibly difficult." Helen nodded. "I didn't know if I had the right to share them with anyone else. But, seeing Sarah, meeting the people who cared about him, I think Mike would want his whole family to be connected." Colonel Patterson leaned forward. "I have to ask, did Mike know you were getting his letters?" "I don't think so," Helen admitted. "I never responded. I think he was writing to the mother he remembered from childhood, or the mother he hoped I could become. I don't think he expected me to actually read them." Thompson shook his head. "He talked about his family sometimes. Never mentioned you specifically, but he talked about hoping broken relationships could be healed with enough patience." "That sounds like Mike," Sarah said, looking around at the group of people who had been brought together by his death. "He always believed people could change, could become better versions of themselves." Jackson spoke up quietly. "Maybe that's what we're all doing now. Becoming better versions of ourselves because of how he loved us." Helen looked around the room at these people who had known her son in ways she never had the chance to. Would you mind if I told you about the little boy he was? Before I messed everything up?" For the next 2 hours, Helen shared stories of Mike as a child, his obsession with helping injured animals, his insistence on sharing his lunch with kids who forgot theirs, his habit of writing thank you notes to his teachers at the end of each school year. The stories painted a picture of a child who was already displaying the character traits that would define him as a man. In return, the others shared their memories of adult Mike, Rodriguez's stories of his artwork and humor, Thompson's accounts of his bravery and leadership, Jackson's memories of his kindness and protective instincts, Colonel Patterson's observations of his character under pressure, and Sarah's intimate knowledge of his dreams and fears and love. As the afternoon wore on, it became clear that they were doing more than sharing memories. They were creating a complete picture of Mike's life and impact, honoring not just the man he became but the journey that shaped him. "I think Mike would love this," Helen said as the gathering began to wind down. "All of us together, taking care of each other the way he always wanted to take care of everyone." Sarah looked around at this unlikely family: a retired Marine colonel, 3 Marines struggling with survivor's guilt, a mother fighting addiction, and herself, a woman learning to live beyond her grief. None of them would have chosen this path, but all of them had been changed by loving the same remarkable man. "We should make this official," Sarah said suddenly. "Helen, I want you to be part of Mike's Bridge. We're creating support networks for military families dealing with loss, and you understand that experience from a perspective none of us have. You know what it's like to lose someone you love because of your own mistakes, and you know what it's like to carry guilt and shame that prevents you from asking for help." Helen looked surprised. "Do you really think I could help other people? Given my history?" "I think you're exactly who some people need to meet," Sarah said firmly. "Someone who understands that grief and guilt can be complicated, that healing doesn't follow a straight path, that love can persist even when relationships are broken." Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "We need diverse perspectives if we're going to help diverse families." Thompson agreed. "Mike always said the best leaders were people who had made mistakes and learned from them." Colonel Patterson stood up. "Then, it's settled. Helen, welcome to Mike's Bridge. Mike would be proud to know that his death brought all of us together and that together, we're going to help other people avoid the isolation we've all experienced." As everyone prepared to leave, Helen pulled Sarah aside. "Thank you for accepting me into this. I know I don't deserve to be part of Mike's legacy." Sarah hugged her tightly. "Mike spent 5 years writing to you because he believed you deserved his love. Who are we to argue with that judgment?" That night, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, wearing Mike's engagement ring and rereading his letters to his mother. She thought about the journey that had brought her from a woman hiding her grief behind a concealed tattoo to someone surrounded by people who understood her loss. The coffee shop incident that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. Those women had mocked her tattoo as meaningless decoration, but it had turned out to be the key that unlocked an entire network of love and support. Mike's death had created a void that could never be filled, but it had also created connections that were transforming multiple lives. Sarah touched her tattoo through her sweater, but, for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel the need to hide it. Tomorrow, she would wear short sleeves to work. She would let people see Mike's memorial and ask questions about it. She would tell them about Mike's Bridge and the work they were doing to help other military families. Mike had asked her in his letter to help his Marines understand that they weren't alone in their grief. But what he had actually accomplished was much bigger than that. He had created a family of people committed to ensuring that no one had to carry loss alone, that everyone deserved support and understanding and hope for healing. Sarah looked at Mike's photo on the mantel, but, for the first time since his death, she didn't say goodbye to it. Instead, she said, "Thank you. Thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you for teaching us how to love each other."